to me, the government is sending messages to us that are quite mixed. And I would really like it if we could have a chat to the government about these things. Wouldn't it be great if the government came down and had a talk to us? Yeah. Well, I'd like to introduce you to the next speaker, the Honourable Phil Twyford. And just as he approaches the stage, if you could all fasten your seatbelts, no standing up, and turn your phones off, okay? Welcome, thank you. So, first of all, I'd like to thank the Minister for giving up his Sunday and coming out. It's you're not an easy room. You're probably not all his voters, and you are affected by some of the changes that are happening. A little bit about the Minister. Mr Twyford was born and raised in Auckland. He is the Labour Member of Parliament for Te Atu, where he lives. Phil is committed to fixing the housing and transport problems that affect our biggest city, as well as much of the rest of the country. In fact, he's undertaken to fix the housing crisis and build 100,000 affordable houses, which is an amazing goal. So, right, yeah, I think it's worth a round of applause, yeah. So rather than doing what the media is doing and opposition is doing, I want to remove the ideology, I want to remove the politics and have what would be, I think, quite a rare constructive discussion with the Minister, put all the questions that I've been building up on my mind, and luckily I've spreadsheeted them here. After studying politics at Auckland University, Phil worked as a journalist and union organiser before becoming founding executive director of Oxfam New Zealand. Upon returning to New Zealand, Phil was elected to Parliament for Labour. In 2008, in opposition, he held the portfolios of housing, transport, Auckland issues, disarmament and arms control. As Minister for Housing and Urban Development and Transport, Phil is looking forward to working with communities to build a better New Zealand. So the format of this discussion is going to be, I'm going to give the stage to Phil for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. We'd like to hear your vision, your message. Then we've pre-agreed the questions, and he's been very kind to me. He said, ask whatever you like, say whatever you like, so the gloves are off, that's awesome. And if there's any time at the end of that, we'll take some questions from the audience. So, Mr. Phil Twyford.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to spend some time with you. I'm looking forward to our conversation and answering your questions, Matt. But if I may make a few opening comments, what I'd like to do is, one, explain what we're trying to achieve with our reform program around housing and urban growth, our motivations for the things that we're doing, and secondly, I want to give you a sense of the breadth of the reform program. But first, I want to acknowledge that all of the policies that we're talking about have within them a lot of change for you and your businesses, and I recognise that they are currently creating considerable uncertainty for you. I hope by the time we finish talking today that you'll understand better where the government's coming from, what we're aiming to achieve, and you'll have less uncertainty about the new environment. Cameron Baggery, the former ANZ chief economist, said the other day that a fundamental shift is set to occur across the property market. He said that capital gains will be harder to come by, and speculative and short-term investors will make way for longer-term ones more focused on yield and cash flow. So why this adjustment? Simply because the increase in house prices that we've seen over the last 2 decades, first a doubling and then, remarkably, a doubling again, is a symptom of a deep crisis in the housing market. that is resulting in disastrous social and economic consequences for our country. Pretty much all of the increase in poverty and inequality that we've seen in the last decade or decade and a half is a direct result of increasing housing costs. We're seeing the worst intergenerational inequity that we've seen in a long time, with what is effectively a transfer of wealth from our kids' generation to baby boomers, to our generation. We now have the lowest rates of home ownership in 66 years. We're going backwards. And unfortunately, record homelessness. Now, I want to be really clear that I'm not laying these things at your door. The responsibility for the mess we're in lies with successive governments who have allowed multiple compounding policy failure to deliver for us, particularly in this city, some of the most expensive house prices in the world relative to local incomes. Now, for what it's worth, from my point of view, the root causes of this mess, this failure to allow our cities and our towns to grow properly, are fourfold. The first is infrastructure. Our system for financing infrastructure is basically broken. It's incredibly hard for developers to access the finance to turn farmland into land that's available for housing, and to prepare the ground in brown and grey fields development for new housing. So we've got to do something about that. The second root cause, in my book, is an overly restrictive planning system that chokes off the supply of new land for development, that stops our city growing up and growing out. And there's only one thing that can happen in those circumstances, and that's you create a pressure cooker effect. And that's why urban land in this city is ridiculously expensive. The third root cause, I think, is a high-cost, low-productivity construction industry that relies on a cottage industry, bespoke model of construction, and a building supplies market that is rife with anti-competitive rorts that mean that we're paying 25, 30% or even more percent for the same building materials than the Australians do. The fourth, I think, is a number of different tax settings that encourage short-term speculation rather than stable long-term yields. Now, it's going to take sustained reform on a number of fronts if we are going to build more houses and actually unpick these policy failures and get the market back on a much sounder footing. So let me run through briefly our reform program, because I want you to see the breadth of it and how the bits all fit together. The first is that we have to address the acute social need that's there right now. We can see it all around us. If you walk through any street in my electorate in West Auckland, you'll see people living in garages. It is just the reality, the level of poverty and appalling housing standards that is rife in suburbs right across this city. We have to do something about that. We cannot have kids growing up in garages and in cars. So that's why in the budget you heard us announce recently $100 million to invest in more emergency supported housing to house the homeless. The lack of affordable rental housing at the bottom end of the market is one of the other things that's driving that hardship. And we stopped the former government's sell-off of state housing, and we are currently investing $4 billion, most of that is off Housing New Zealand's balance sheet, into the building of 6,400 net additional state houses around New Zealand. The third thing is, and Matt, you alluded to this, is reforming the tenancy laws. The purpose is not to make life more difficult for landlords. The purpose is to modernise our tenancy laws. We believe that given that a third of us are now renters, it's time to modernise the laws, and we believe we can find reforms that will work for both landlords and tenants that will encourage more security of tenure. Not uncommon in the last few years, in a rising market, for tenants to be moved on average every year, sometimes even more frequently. The effect that transience has, particularly on families with young children, is terribly corrosive to the life chances of those children and the quality of life of families. We have to find ways to encourage more security of tenure, longer-term tenancies. Our KiwiBuild program is designed not only to stimulate new housing supply, but to use the government's balance sheet to incentivise the building of affordable homes. Only 5% of new builds are in the lower quartile, are anything like affordable to first-home buyers. So we have to do everything we can to encourage more affordable homes. So over the next 12 months, from July 1 through, we're intending to build 1,000 KiwiBuild homes, 5,000 in the year after that, 10,000 in the year after that, and then about 12,000 on average to reach 100,000 by 2028. I know there's no shortage of doubters that we can do this, but believe me, we will. Sweden, a country similar in size to us, built 1 million homes in the 1970s as part of a government-backed building program. We're talking about building the same number of homes per head of population that was being built in New Zealand in the 1970s. It's not science fiction. And we're committed to working with the private sector, with the development community. We recently released the tender documents for our Buy Off the Plans program, which is about speeding up and making developments happen that are currently stranded because of lack of access to finance. And if developers want to work with us, if they want to deliver a certain number of affordable KiwiBuild homes that meet the criteria, then we will underwrite or buy those units off the plan. We're also working directly with developers, making available repurposed government land on a deferred payment basis if a certain number of units are provided that are in those developments that are affordable and meet the KiwiBuild criteria. You will have seen that we recently purchased nearly 30 hectares of land at Unitec in Mount Albert. It's going to be a brand spanking new urban community there, and that we expect to build where we'll build more than 3,000 homes. We're also, as you all know, we're making a number of changes to the tax settings. And our intention is that this is a critical part of trying to get supply and demand back into a better balance. What we've observed at the height of the last two cycles is that the demand pressures have been so intense and so out of control that the Reserve Bank has identified the housing market as a risk to the stability of the entire financial system. That can't be good. So while the market has cooled in Auckland, what we do know is that it will eventually pick up. But if we can change the tax settings now, it won't, when it does next pick up, it won't reach the giddy heights of the last two cycles. So for that reason, yes, we are ring-fencing losses. And we think that will make an incremental difference. We're pushing the Bright Line test out to 5 years. We currently have a bill before the Parliament, the Overseas Investment Amendment Bill, which is designed to protect the New Zealand housing market from uncontrolled flows of foreign investment. That can be destabilising. But at the same time, we want foreign direct investment in new developments. And finally, the tax working group that's been chaired by Sir Michael Cullen, it's been charged with the job of designing a fairer tax system for all of New Zealand so that everyone pays their fair share. And also to encourage the productive economy that generates jobs and exports. And so they'll come back with proposals that the government will consider at the end of this year. We have a particular problem in Auckland. The problems that I've been describing are most concentrated, most acute and on the biggest scale here in this city. There are three things that we think we have to do to get the market back into much better shape. The first is that we have to grow the market for intensification. Auckland's going to get another million people in the next 30 to 40 years. There's very little that we can do to stop that. Short of putting barbed wire up on the Bombay Hills, handing out contraceptive pills, there's very little that we can do. We have to manage that growth, which is what we have failed spectacularly to do over the last couple of decades. So we need to do density well. You know, we all love Sydney when we go there. All we're looking at now in Auckland is the kind of density that Sydney's had for 50 years. So we want that to happen. We're in the process of legislating to set up an urban development authority that will have all of the powers that local government currently has a monopoly on. And its task will be to lead and facilitate large-scale urban development projects like a Hobsonville, but particularly around the rail network in the city where people have access to high-quality transport connections. It's about de-risking these developments for private sector capital to come in and invest and do what it does well, and that is design and build and sell great places for people to live in. So that the Urban Development Authority will work in places like the Unitec block in Mount Albert and a dozen others around the city. This is going to create huge opportunities for the development community. The next thing is that we need to invest in a transport system to support our city's growth. And we recently landed a fully funded 10-year transport plan for Auckland. Roads, motorways, public transport, rapid transit. And the light rail lines that we plan to build from Auckland out to Mangere and then out from Auckland City out to the northwest, the big northwest growth corridor, they will be urban renewal catalysts. And if you've been recently to the Gold Coast, to Sydney, to Newcastle or further afield, where cities are investing in light rail to deliver top quality rapid transit, but also as a stimulus for urban development and private investment, you'll know how powerful that can be. And the third thing that we have to do to grow the market for intensification is the unitary plan needs to be more permissive of growth, of quality intensification. And in our view, the unitary plan was quite a step forward from what we had before, but it doesn't go far enough. So we're going to work with Auckland Council to go further and allow the city to grow up. We want good urban design standards, but we cannot keep this lid on the city. The second thing we need to do in Auckland is fix infrastructure financing. And for the last 6 months, we've had the Treasury working on new ways of financing infrastructure. And at the moment, it's a terrible burden on developers who struggle to access the finance to invest in new infrastructure. Our councils are already heavily leveraged and simply don't have any headroom to keep borrowing. And what we want to do is access long-term debt finance at the cheapest possible costs that only government can access, and make that available to developers who are willing to take the commercial risk on a development, and ultimately service that debt from a targeted rate on the properties in a new development. It's how they do it in Texas, a bunch of other states in the US, and a number of other places around the world. It's not in addition to the current financing mechanisms, it's an alternative. It will spread the cost of infrastructure over the lifetime of that asset in a much fairer and rational way, and it will make land markets in Auckland much, much more competitive. The third thing is it's our policy to get rid of the urban growth boundary. We have to allow our city to grow. It doesn't mean uncontrolled sprawl without decent infrastructure. We actually have to do more planning to protect areas of special value, to lay down the grid for infrastructure and future transport networks. But we should then allow people to build and develop as long as they can carry the costs of the infrastructure. And that will, if we achieve that, I believe we will restore the urban land market to a level of sanity that so many other cities around the world enjoy. And housing will once again become more affordable. Now, I understand that some of these policies will have serious impacts on your businesses. But if we have the political courage to see these reforms through, we will deliver a more competitive urban land market. Land prices will come down. We will get a more competitive and productive construction industry, a more stable and less volatile housing market, and ultimately, better quality and lower cost housing for our kids. Thank you.
Well said, thank you. So if we could just start with a few questions on KiwiBuild, which I'm a fan of, by the way, because it is going to produce affordable housing. What is it, $595 for a two-bedroom or $600 for a two-bedroom house, $650 for a three-bedroom house?
That's correct, yeah.
And just for the benefit of the room who hasn't thought about this, if you're a developer and you're building houses, $900,000 to $1.5 million target price point, which is a common thing to do because there's money in it, and so everybody targets that stuff, it's risky to go into the low-cost, high-density stuff because you're just not sure that that market's there. And so KiwiBuild is a supply incentive to turn developers' attention to this, and the supply incentive is finance. But my question in relation to the finance is you're giving us the opportunity to tender to become an approved KiwiBuild participant, and you will give us backstop underwrites, effectively. It's a backstop purchase plan, isn't it? Where you will underwrite the purchase if we can't sell it to somebody else. The government will buy it, then you'll on-sell it to social housing. And otherwise, you will buy it outright at the beginning for an agreed price and then on-sell it to social housing yourself.
Yes, it matters not social housing. All of the KiwiBuild homes are designed to be sold on to first home buyers.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I've read somewhere that the KiwiBuild will be, for outright purchases, 85% will be sold to qualifying buyers who are first home buyers and 15% to social housing. Is that incorrect?
No, yeah. Well, KiwiBuild's all homes for private home ownership. So
Okay.
we've got a big state house building program alongside it, but that's separate.
So as a developer,
Yep.
That's great. As a developer, I divert my development to you. A great example is 53 McLeod Road in your area in Te Atatu. I'm currently consenting 5 houses, and I'm looking at the possibility of building 12. So I then sell it to the government, either outright or I get an underwrite for it. But then as a developer, I still have to put 30% in. So how's your supply incentive going to deal with that? Because at the moment, the market is starved for finance, and the banks say you must have 90% pre-sales or 60% pre-sales, whatever it is, plus you must have 30% deposit. So I think you get the first tick with it, but I'm wondering where that second tick's going to come from, because that's the problem in the market.
Yeah, so at this point, the policy just is essentially, as you describe, it's about underwriting or doing pre-sales. We've spent the last couple of months out talking to the market and talking with a lot of developers. The response we've had in the last week and a half has been phenomenal. Our hope is that the pre-sales and underwriting will be enough to free up the kind of logjam that we've currently got because of a lack of liquidity. So our hope is that that's going to, a lot of developments that are currently stalled will happen. So that's as kind of far as we're intending to go. So,
Okay, so you're not going to offer straight funding to developers?
No, it's not our intention to.
Okay.
Yeah.
The developers in the room, is this reserved for the large developers? Is this for the little guys? How far down do you bring this?
Large and small, so no limit.
Okay.
Yep.
And in terms of the feedback I've had, a lot of people have said that in dealing with these public tenders, the government says that. They say, bring it all, we want to deal with you all, and then they do the opposite and deal with the big guys.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, no, I hear a lot of complaints about government tendering processes, and we want to make them as user-friendly as possible. This cannot be a big, heavy, long-term thing that involves risk and delay for developers. We're all about trying to kickstart the industry And believe me, I'm under a lot of pressure to deliver here. So, we want results, and we know people desperately want to see results.
So your shared equity scheme that's been talked about in the media recently, is that going to be combined with KiwiBuild, is it?
So we know that, for a lot of people, if I go on telly and I say, we're going to build affordable homes, a 3-bedroom home for under 650,000, you can hear the spluttering right across the suburbs of people go, well, that's not affordable. And it's true for a lot of people. House prices are so out of whack compared to incomes that for large numbers of people who would love the sniff of an opportunity to buy a home, a $600,000 mortgage or a $550,000 mortgage is just out of reach. So what we want to do is basically set up a shared equity program where a third-party investor, which could be a private, public, or a hybrid, would own a share in the property for a period of time. And then the home owner, after they've paid down their share of the mortgage, would have the opportunity to buy out that equity share. So it would lower the threshold and mean you've got a smaller mortgage, smaller deposit and smaller payments in order to get started. Now, there are some successful models around both in New Zealand and overseas on this, but the challenge is actually mobilising the capital to sustain this program. And I've got officials looking at ways that the government can provide a kind of a safe home for this capital, and I'm hoping we can get different kinds of private and public investment into a capital fund that would support it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that follows from this with low-cost housing to first-home buyers, they do their numbers on 5%. They get an underwrite from the government, so 5% interest rates. Time moves on, they build the house, interest rates, something disruptive happens, interest rates go to 7%. The developer's got an underwrite, but they've sold the property. Does the underwrite expire? Because at that point, the developer would have a bunch of low-income people, relatively lower, and low equity, and they would then be exposed because of the nature of the person buying the asset.
Yeah, so...
how do you deal with interest rate exposure?
Well, interest rates are probably never going to be lower than they are right now.
I guess my real question is, does the underwrite still apply if they default?
Yeah, it does. So intrinsic to the whole idea of KiwiBuild is sharing some risk.
Yep.
We're putting the government into the game, we're sharing risk with developers and to an extent the home buyer, but we can't take all the risk. And so we're responsible for taxpayers' money. We have to be as careful as possible on this, and we can't de-risk this entirely. So no, the developer's still going to kind of carry that commercial risk.
I think a banking system will just deliver that to you, because if you have to put 30% in, then you're completely insulated, aren't you? Shall we move on to red tape and RMA? As I said earlier, there is 220 days at the moment to get a consent out of council. And they have recently published their latest development levy pricing, and they've identified a $1.4 billion blowout in their long-term plan for uncosted infrastructure. And so their solution to this is to simply put the price up $10,000 for water care and development levies. Recently in your area in Te Atu, I built a house and three houses actually, and the infrastructure down the street cost me $110,000. And they didn't blink in asking me to build it, and I said, oh, really, do I have to put this in, because all of my neighbours are going to connect to this? And there didn't seem to be any sense of equity in this, that I was building infrastructure for my neighbours. And it just seems to be a tax and spend type attitude in there, and no accountability for timeframes. And in an environment where you're seeking affordable housing outcomes, I think this is being deeply undermined by council's tardiness and just putting the prices up like this. Do you have a view on whether council should have a sense of accountability, and should they have an affordable housing policy?
So, Matt, I think let me respond to two parts of the question. So the first is about the council's role as a land use regulator and consenting authority. I agree that they are not efficient enough and timely enough. and time is money in this game, and the delays and the uncertainty and the risk associated with the consenting process are one of the core problems that we have. And so we're working on things that we could do to put a rocket under Auckland Council and other councils, particularly in the high growth centres around the country, to get better results and better performance there. The problem with development contributions going up, it's a major problem, and it highlights for me the fact that the system for financing infrastructure is broken. We can't ask the ratepayer to shell out more and more for development. Auckland's growth needs are so massive, you cannot fund that infrastructure through rates. People just won't accept it. It would be impossible to do. It's not rational or feasible for central government to be writing a cheque for $1 billion every few months to do this. And I can't stand up in places like Palmerston North and Wanganui and Balclutha and say, I want you guys to write a cheque for all of Auckland's growth infrastructure, because they won't cop it either. We have to find ways to finance infrastructure for Auckland's growth from Auckland. And it should come from the communities that are in the developments that are benefiting from that infrastructure. That's the only rational way to do it. So we're looking at an entirely new alternative system, a new system for financing infrastructure.
So when you say the community, you're saying that that's the local community that benefit from the pipe, for example, that's being put in the ground. They should pay for that.
Yeah. So the idea the most logical way to do it would be through a targeted rate for 40 or 50 years on that property. Now that's not, I want to stress, that's not on top of. At the moment, you know, if a greenfields, a home and land package in a greenfields development...
On that property, or that series of properties that benefit from the pipe?
A series.
Okay.
So at the moment, you know, $100,000 of the price of a new home in a greenfields development could be infrastructure. You know, it all ends up on the price tag of the home, right? Yeah. The home buyer pays, and then they just pay it off on their mortgage. So that is such an inefficient way to do it.
At the moment, it's $46,000 per title for council fees, and that will be $56,000 for that 10 grand raise.
Yep, and I know that's an impediment. I know that's driving up prices.
So on your 100-lot subdivision, it's 100 times that.
Yep. So that's why we have to reform the whole system for financing infrastructure.
So do you have some detail around that? Because that's so in Australia.
Yep.
I was told you I was developing in Australia, and if I wanted to connect to infrastructure, there was a public infrastructure scheme where the cost of the infrastructure was socialised across the Melbourne, where I was developing, and I would pay connection fees that had in it the original cost plus some return for the funder. Is that essentially what you're talking about, the Australian model? It's
not dissimilar. I mean, the model that I think works best is one that they have in a number of states in the US, where you get access to long-term debt finance at very low rates. It sits on a balance sheet somewhere, and we're looking at the option of basically not the government's balance sheet, certainly can't be the council's balance sheet.
You're saying the investor borrows it?
No, well, the government makes it available. The investor takes the commercial risk on the development, including the infrastructure costs, but ultimately the debt would be serviced by a targeted rate on the properties in the new development.
Wow, so you're saying that private developers would be given funding for public infrastructure and then get it paid off over a period of time?
Over 40 or 50 years, over the lifetime of the asset.
Government guaranteed?
Yeah.
And do they get a return for that?
The private investors who lend the money?
Yeah. Do they get to make a margin on that, or is it at cost?
We haven't worked out that detail yet.
Yeah.
But
because that sounds like good fun. I'd get involved in that.
We'll get back to you on the margin.
Okay. Yeah. So talk to us about timeframes with council. So you're going to build 100,000 houses. That's 10,000 more a year, 5,000 more in Auckland. And at the moment, it's 220 days to make that happen, just to get to building consent. What's the solution there? Because, as I said to you, I was in Australia, and there was a local land court, and I could spend $50, and in 2 weeks, I was in front of a referee, and I could sit the city councillor down in front of the referee and say, my application's passed its statutory time frame. And the referee would look at council, somewhat, incredulous, and say, what's going on, council? Is there any reason why I should not award this land use consent, resource consent? And council would say, well, no, we just haven't got to it. And then the referee would say, well, you're wasting Mr. Gilligan's money. He's spending interest on this development. They'd tell him off in front of me and order council to give me a consent in 3 working days. And as I said to you, I did 10 of them, and it got to the 7th one, and I lodged concurrently with the application for the consent. And so when I got to VCAT, which is the land court, they complained that I was abusing the process, and council said to the referee said to the councillor, well, based on your track record, it's little wonder that Mr. Gilligan would lodge as he lodges his consent. So that is the Australian model. As I've said elsewhere, it takes 6 weeks to get a consent for a 50-storey building in Brisbane. Here it would take 3 years. How are we going to break this? Because it's nonsense.
So Matt, when you look at the Australian housing market and parts of Australia, particularly Sydney, they've got a lot in common with our problems here. But I look at Queensland and it's a different world. A society that is so similar in many ways to New Zealand and to Auckland, in so many ways, but their entire system there is based around encouraging development, not trying to stop it. And they basically have a one-stop shop mentality. I don't know whether they quite give you a glass of champagne at the door when you walk up the steps to the council consenting office. But,
they don't.
But it has a similar effect. And I like the land court idea. I think that's something that we should have a look at.
Yep.
So
very good.
there are 2 big issues about councils. One is this question of the efficiency of the consenting process, and the other is that the planning rules that the council makes are so restrictive that they choke off the supply of available land. They stop the city growing up and out, and we've got to deal with both of those problems.
Yeah, I would say that in my own experience of dealing with Auckland Council, the planners have changed their tune. They used to be disappointed when they couldn't find a reason to say no, it would seem. And now they actually feel quite constructive. They've been turned. They know they've got to produce a supply.
Yep.
But engineering is a different story. Parks and water care are different stories. And that is just such a log jam at the moment. If we could talk about foreign buyer bans. Many developers are very concerned, especially the medium to larger size ones, that you're just going to completely undermine their ability to fund because they rely on foreign buyers to purchase. Foreign buyers want to purchase for long-term investment. They're trying to get their capital out of China and places like that. They don't want to take it back. It raises concerns for them over there. It's about security of their capital is often a reason they're getting it here. So I know I've heard the PM say that New Zealand land is for New Zealanders, but it's okay, you can send your capital here to build a house, but you have to sell it within 12 months. Then in the same week, I've heard you say you quite like the Australian model, which is off the plan sales for new housing is okay. I think you're on record in December last year saying this, and you would like to follow the Australian model where foreigners can buy new homes only because it stimulates supply, solving the problem. I mean, if you have a new house, either a New Zealand resident lives in it, either through ownership or by living here and renting it. It's one or the other. So what's wrong with foreign buyers? You know?
So Matt, it's difficult for me to talk in great detail about this because the bill is before the Parliament. It hasn't yet been reported back from the Select Committee back to the House. So it would be against the rules for me to talk in detail about it. But the intention that we've always had, and that is to protect the existing housing stock from uncontrolled flows of foreign investment and encourage foreign direct investment in new builds, that is still our intent. And I'm confident that you'll see the bill when it comes back to the Parliament will achieve those aims, particularly for large scale, for apartment developments and multi-unit dwellings. So we need foreign capital to invest in those large developments, but we don't need huge surges of offshore capital coming in and speculating in housing stock and adding to the demand pressures on what internationally is a tiny real estate market.
But is purchasing demand? Purchasing is actually supply. It's the person giving the money to build it.
If we're talking
demand
about new
is
builds,
occupation.
yes.
Yeah.
If we're talking about new builds, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Anti-investor sentiment. I have felt that certainly a lot of the rhetoric coming out of the government, especially during the election, described our community as speculators, very emotionally loaded terms that, and I won't reiterate the point. Why is that? Why does the government call us all speculators and describe housing as unproductive? Because if you look at Maslow's needs hierarchy, number one on the list is shelter. And that is what we provide. We receive, for example, we get a house that has just been destroyed by a tenant. We sigh, we move in, we repaint it, we rejuvenate it, we present it back to the housing pool, and a tenant moves in. That's our function as long-term investors. Even short-term investors who are speculators are rejuvenating the housing stock that is otherwise run down and destroyed. Yet we are vilified in the media and described as being non-productive. That is the sentiment. So do you see the investors as part of the problem or part of the solution?
Well, I would have to say both, Matt. Part of the solution, because we need investment. We need people who are committed to being in the market for stable long-term yields, and in the case of residential real estate, being good landlords, right? We need that. Of course we do. But the character of the Auckland market particularly, over the last 2 cycles, has at the peak of the cycle resembled a Ponzi scheme, where we've seen houses being sold and on-sold again at ridiculously inflated prices. The effect of that is disastrous for our community, for our families, and no doubt for your kids and your extended families as well. That can't go on. Now, speculation, that's simply the buying and selling for capital gain, that is part of the problem. If we treat housing simply and only as an investment class, we'll never fix this problem. We have to recognise that the market, as well as being an investment class, has to deliver on the expectations of New Zealanders for decent quality housing at an affordable price, whether you're renting or
So let's
buying.
test this Ponzi scheme. Hands up if you're a long-term investor. Keep your hand up if you've sold a property in the last 3 years. There are your speculators, 20% at best. And those could also be...
Don't vilify them, man.
Those could also be people that have cashed up part of their portfolio because they were rebalancing their portfolio. So even, there's a community of people who are long-term investors, yet we're describing them in the media, lumping them all in together as speculators. Is that constructive, do you think?
No, Matt,
It's alienating them.
Matt, I accept your point.
Yeah. It's populist, isn't
the
it?
objective of the debate is not to vilify people or individuals or investors. Yeah. But the point is, we have to realise in this country that speculation, put aside the people we're talking about, the speculative frenzy that we saw at the top of the cycle is enormously destructive. We cannot allow it to go on. It has to change. We have to find a more competitive and stable market that delivers good long-term yields for investors, but actually delivers affordable housing, whether you're renting or owning. Yeah. That's why we have this reform program. And I think that if we work together to implement these reforms, we will actually return stability and affordability to the market.
Well, I certainly don't disagree with everything you're saying, but I think that, and I'll just say that I think you're on track with your supply comments. My view is this room is your solution. They rejuvenate the housing stock, whether they're selling it or whether they're representing it back to their tenants, they are your solution. In addition, these same people build houses. And constructive language would be nice. So, in terms of your goal to increase supply, how do you see taxation as being the taxation changes as being consistent with that? Because what you're doing is you're reducing the liquidity of a group of people who are trying to build houses for the supply in a finance-starved environment. And in the same breath, you're reducing their liquidity, which is pressuring their ability to borrow.
Do you mean by the loss ring fencing?
Loss ring fencing, yeah.
Yeah. So, loss ring fencing will make, at the margins, it won't make a difference to the most recent investment decision, but it will make a difference to the next one.
So, when you look at these loss ring fencing rules, the people who are affected the most are the people that have no deposit or low income. The Kiwi battlers who are fighting their way up using the property ladder to get there. One would have thought that was your constituency, your voter base. And I would have thought that looking forwards at the impact of these rules, give it 2, 3, 4 years, if interest rates spike from 5 to 8%, 9%, something disruptive happens. The people who will be most affected would be your constituents. Putting it another way, you're serving them up as insolvent dishes to wealthy people. Because as they become cash flow impaired with interest rates going up, poor people are most impacted by these rules. Rich people are cash positive, they don't care. And as the poor people get run through the mill because they can't claim tax losses, because that valve on the property economy that lets some of the steam off the ability to claim tax losses as interest rates go up, which is beyond their control, that's not there. So you're going to run a whole bunch of low net worth people through the mill and feed them to the high net worth people. Your comment on that?
Well, there's no question that loss ring fencing will create a slightly higher barrier to entry for new people coming into the market. There's no question about that. But when you put it together alongside the other adjustments to the tax settings, it's going to mean that next time the real estate cycle picks up, it won't be quite as intense and quite as frenzied. There's no question about that.
CGT is a incentive to free up the housing stock for new investors and homeowners. But an investor that, say, has a property for $500,000 that doubles to $1 million over a decade is now sitting on a $500,000 gain. They could sell that, pay tax, $167,000, and then pocket the $333,000, or they could gear up the $500,000 gain at 65%, pocket the $330,000 and not sell the property. In fact, they get richer if they don't. CGT is a tax incentive to not sell. You get a lock-in effect of it. And secondly, by exempting private homes, you get a mansion effect. These are two effects overseas, aren't they? The mansion effect is that everybody works out that family homes are exempt CGT, so everybody has the biggest house. Houses get bigger, more expensive. So home ownership becomes distorted by the exemption and the mansion effect, and there's a lock-in effect. It actually has the opposite to what the government's trying to achieve.
Well, so you're right, those two effects are part of, I think, any consideration or debate around a capital gains tax. Let me stress that a CGT is not our policy. It's one, I think, of a number of things that the tax working group will be considering, and they'll report back to us. But look, we're the only country bar one in the OECD that doesn't have a capital gains tax. We need in this country to tax labour less and capital more, assets. Most of the people who are extremely wealthy in this country, who make their money from assets, they pay virtually no tax. That's not fair. That's not good for the economy. So we need a tax system that actually encourages work, that encourages businesses, but actually taxes people fairly. And that's the brief that the tax working group has been given. I wouldn't have thought that there's anybody in this room who would be affected by it. If you're a professional investor, you're not going to be affected by a CGT.
Well, here's an idea for you, because we were laughing during the election that a vote for Labor is a vote for GRA, because you're going to create so much compliance cost for CGT, accountants are going to get rich. Have you considered not simply extending the Brightline rules to 10 years, because it would have the same effect? It would be a very cheap, non-disruptive, low-cost way of achieving the outcome you're after. Of course, it's not a comprehensive capital gains tax. It's not taxing business. So if you're trying to get there, then you need to go that route. But that's another way of getting there. Hey, I think we'll leave it there. Amazing that you came out. Thanks so much to take your Sunday afternoon off and come and speak so candidly with us.
Really appreciate the chance to come along. You've been very generous. You've given me a lot of time today, and I appreciate that. I also appreciate the feedback that you've given, and I will take that away, and I'd be very happy to come back anytime in the future.
Excellent, you'd be most welcome. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Cheers.